Hello, my name is Isaac, and my goal is to bring you a bunch of classic audiobooks in an easy and accessible way. By popular vote, I am going to be starting recording The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka today. And we're going to be answering the question of would Franz Kafka still hate life if he were a bug? The answer will not surprise you. At all. Is this? I don't even know if it's broken into chapters. Oh, it is broken into chapters. Okay. This story is broken up into a couple of individual chapters. I will be breaking it up because I've got like 60 pages. I'm going to be breaking this up into its chapters like it is in the book because it's about 60 pages long. And if I'm going to be trying to do soundscaping and things like that, then I need a shorter book. But without further ado, let us begin. Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. The transformation of Gregor Samsa. 1. One morning, Gregor Samsa woke up in his bed from uneasy dreams and found he had turned into a huge verminous insect. He lay on his hard shell-like back, and when he raised his head slightly, he saw his rounded brown underbelly, divided into a series of curved ridges, on which the bedding could scarcely stay in place and was about to flip off completely. His numerous legs, which were pitifully thin relative to the rest of his body, wriggled helplessly in front of his eyes. What has happened to me? He thought. It was not a dream. His room, quite adequate for one person, though rather too small, was there as usual with its familiar 4 walls. Spread out on a table was a collection of samples of material he had unpacked. Samsa was a travelling salesman, and above it hung the picture he had recently cut out of an illustrated magazine and set in a handsome gilt frame. It showed a lady with a fur hat and wrap, sitting upright and holding out towards the viewer a heavy fur muff which covered the whole of her forearm. Then Gregor turned his eyes towards the window, and the dreary weather, he could hear the rain dripping onto the metal window ledge, made him feel quite depressed. Why don't I just sleep on a little longer and forget all this nonsense? He thought. But that was quite impossible. He was used to sleeping on his right side, and in his present situation he could not get into that position. However hard he tried to throw himself to the right, he always rolled onto his back again. He must have tried 100 times. He closed his eyes so he did not have to see his wriggling legs, and only gave up when he began to feel a slight dull ache in his side that he had never felt before. Oh God, he thought, what a strenuous job I've chosen. On the move, day in, day out. The stresses of this work are much greater than in the office at home. The stresses of this work are much greater than in the office at home. And on top of all that, I'm plagued with all this travelling. Have to worry about catching trains. Put up with irregular bad meals and constantly meeting different people for short time without ever getting to know them more closely. To hell with it. He felt a slight itch on his belly and squirmed slowly on his back towards the bedpost so that he could raise his head more easily. He found the place that was itching. It was covered with small white spots that he could not account for. He tried to feel the place with one of his legs, but withdrew it immediately because he felt a cold shiver whenever he touched it. He slid back to his previous position. All this getting up early, he thought, numbs the mind. Other travellers live like women in a harem. For instance, if I go back to my lodgings during the morning to dispatch the orders I've taken, these gentlemen are having their breakfasts. I should try that with my boss. He'd sack me on the spot. Still, who knows? That might suit me very well. If it weren't for the sake of my parents, I'd have given notice long ago. I would have gone up to the boss and told him what I thought from the bottom of my heart. He would have fallen off his desk. It's a strange way he has, too, sitting up there on his desk and talking down to his employees. And what's more, you have to go right up to him because he's hard of hearing. Well, I haven't given up all hope yet. Once I've saved up enough money to pay off what my parents owe him, it can't be more than another 5 or 6 years, I'll do it for sure. Then that'll be the end of it. Still, for the moment, I must get up. My train goes at 5. He looked at the alarm clock that was ticking on the chest of drawers. Dear God in heaven, he thought. It was 6:30, and the hands were moving steadily on. It was even gone 2:30, getting on for 1:45. Had the alarm not gone off? He could see from his bed that it had been correctly set for 4 o'clock. It must have rung. Yes. But was it possible to sleep peacefully through that din that shook the furniture? Well, he had not slept peacefully, though probably all the more deeply. But what was he to do now? The next train went at 7. To catch it, he would have to make a mad dash. The samples hadn't been packed yet, and didn't feel particularly fresh and lively himself either. And even if he did catch the train, he wouldn't avoid a thunderous rebuke from his boss, because the message boy from the firm would have been waiting for the 5 o'clock train and would have reported his absence long since. He was the boss's creature, spineless and stupid. What if he were to call in sick? But that would be extremely embarrassing and suspicious, for Gregor had never once been sick in 5 years of service. His boss would surely come along with the doctor from the insurance company. He would complain to his parents about their lazy son, and dismiss any excuses by referring to the doctor, who regarded everyone as perfectly healthy, but sometimes work-shy. Besides, would he be so very wrong in this case? Gregor did in fact feel quite well, apart from feeling drowsy, which was quite unwarranted after such a long sleep. Indeed, he even felt extremely hungry. While he was thinking all this over in a great hurry without being able to bring himself to get out of bed, just then the alarm clock struck 7:15. There was a cautious knock on the door behind his head. It was his mother.
"Gregor," she called, "it's 7:15. Weren't you going away?"
That gentle voice. Gregor was alarmed when he heard himself answer. It was unmistakably his own voice, but it was mixed with a painful pipping from inside of him that he could not suppress. The words could be understood clearly only the moment they were uttered, but then the sounds became so distorted that one could not tell whether one had heard them properly. Gregor had wanted to give a full answer and explain everything, but in the circumstances he merely replied, Yes, thank you, mother. I'm getting up now." His mother must not have noticed the change in Gregor's voice through the wood door, for she was reassured by this explanation and shuffled off. But this brief exchange had alerted the other members of the family to the fact that Gregor was unexpectedly still at home, and now his father was banging feebly, but with his fist on one of the doors. "Gregor! Gregor!" he called. "What's going on?" And after a short pause, he spoke more urgently, in a deeper voice. "Gregor! Gregor!" At the other door, though his sister asked softly and plaintively,
"Gregor, are you unwell? Is there anything you need?"
Gregor replied to both of them, "I'm coming now," making great effort to speak as normally as possible by pronouncing his words with the utmost care, and taking long pauses between each of them. His father went back to his breakfast, but his sister whispered,
"Gregor, open the door, I beseech you."
But Gregor had no intention of letting her in. On the contrary, he congratulated himself on the cautious habits he had acquired while travelling of locking all doors at night, even when he was at home. He first intended to get up quietly without interruption, to get dressed, and above all, have breakfast. Then he would think about how to proceed, for he realized perfectly well that nothing sensible would be achieved by laying in bed thinking. He recalled that he had often felt some slight discomfort, perhaps brought on by laying awkwardly in bed, which on getting up had turned out to be purely imaginary, and he was curious to know how what he had imagined this morning would gradually fade away. He had not the slightest doubt that the change in his voice was nothing more than the symptom of a severe cold, an occupational illness of the travelling salesman. It was a simple matter to remove the bed cover. He only needed to expand a little, and it just slid off. But then things became more difficult, especially because he was so unusually broad. He would have needed hands and arms to get himself upright, but instead, he only had all these little legs, which continually waved about in different directions. And in any case, he was unable to control them. When he tried to bend one of them, the first thing it did was to straighten itself out. And if he finally managed to get the leg to do what he wanted, all the others in the meantime would wriggle about in an intense state of excitement, as if they had been liberated. "You can't just stay in bed doing nothing," Gregor said to himself. The first thing he tried to do was to get the lower part of his body out of bed. But this part, which in any case he had not yet seen, and could not properly imagine to himself, proved very difficult to move. It took so long that when, becoming almost frantic, he finally summoned all his strength and shoved himself forward regardless, he chose the wrong direction and collided violently with the far bedpost. The sharp pain he felt taught him that this lower part of his body was, for the moment, perhaps the most sensitive. So then he tried to get his upper body out of bed first, and cautiously turned his head towards the edge of the bed. He managed this easily, and finally, in spite of his width and weight, the whole of his body slowly followed the turn of his head. But when his head was at last out of bed, hanging in midair, he was afraid to make any further progress this way, because if he were to fall, it would really need a miracle to save him from injuring his head. And at all costs, he must not lose consciousness just now. He had better stay in bed. But when, after a similar struggle, he lay there panting, still in the same place, once again watching his tiny legs fighting each other, if anything, even more wildly than before, and finding it impossible to calm or control their wayward behavior, he again told himself that he could not possibly stay in bed, and that the most sensible thing would be to risk anything that might give him even the slightest hope of getting him out of bed. Meanwhile, he took care to remind himself from time to time that thinking in the most calm and collected way was far better than taking desperate measures. At such moments, he focused his gaze as sharply as he could on the window. But unfortunately, there was little to encourage him or cheer him up in the sight of the morning fog that even obscured the other side of the narrow street. 7 o'clock already, he said to himself as the alarm clock struck again. 7 o'clock, and there's still such a fog. And for a while he lay there quietly, breathing gently as if he expected that in the total stillness things might return to normal. But then he said to himself, I absolutely have to get all of myself out of bed before it strikes 7:15. In any case, by then someone from the office will have come to ask about me, because the office opens before 7. And then he set about getting the whole length of his body out of bed by rocking steadily to and fro. If he managed to fall out of bed in this way, his head, which he would lift quickly as he fell, would probably not be injured. His back seemed to be hard. Surely nothing would happen to it if he fell onto the carpet. What concerned him most was the loud crash that would inevitably result, and which would surely cause anxiety, if not alarm, to those on the other side of the doors. But that was the risk he had to take. By the time Gregor was hanging halfway out of the bed, this new method was more like a game than a struggle. He only needed to keep rocking to and fro. It occurred to him how simple it would all be if someone came to help him. 2 strong people, he thought of his father and the maid, would have been quite enough. They would only have to put their arms underneath his rounded back, scoop him out of bed, bend down with their load, and then just carefully help to roll him over onto the floor, where he hoped he would find out what his tiny legs could do. But quite apart from the fact that the doors were locked, ought he really call for help? For all his distress, he could not help smiling at the thought. By rocking more vigorously, he had reached the point where he could scarcely keep his balance, and very soon he would have to make the final decision, for in 5 minutes it would be 7:15. Then there was a ring at the door of the apartment. That's someone from the office, he said to himself and almost froze, while his legs just went on waving about all the faster. For a moment, there was silence. They're not opening the door, Gregor said to himself, clinging to some absurd hope. But then, of course, the maid, as usual, went with firm steps to the door and opened it. Gregor only needed to hear the first word the visitor uttered to know who it was. The head clerk himself. Why ever did Gregor have the misfortune of being employed by a firm where the slightest delay immediately aroused the greatest suspicion? Were all his employers idlers, every one of them? Was there not one loyal and devoted person among them who, if he failed to put in just a few hours of the morning in the service of the firm, suffered such pangs of consciousness that he lost his head and was incapable of getting out of bed? Wouldn't it be quite enough to send a junior trainee to inquire, if such inquiries were necessary at all? Did the head clerk himself have to come? And did Gregor's whole blameless family have to be shown in this way that the investigation of such a suspicious matter could only be entrusted to the competence of the head clerk? And it was more because of the state of agitation these thoughts induced in Gregor than of any actual decision on his part that he swung himself with all his strength out of bed. There was a loud thud, but it was not really a crash. His fall was slightly muffled by the carpet, and his back was more flexible than Gregor had thought, so the dull thud he made was not so noticeable at all. But he had banged his head because he had not held it up carefully enough. He shook it and rubbed it on the floor in fury and pain. Something fell over in there, said the head clerk in the next room to the left. Gregor tried to imagine whether something similar could ever happen to the head clerk as happened to him today. Such a possibility had to be allowed after all. But as if in brusque answer to this question, the clerk's lacquered boots squeaked as he took a few firm steps to the next room. From the side room to the right, his sister informed him in a whisper.
Gregor, the head clerk is here.
I know, said Gregor to himself, but he did not dare to raise his voice enough for her to hear. Gregor, his father then said from the room on the left. The head clerk has come to inquire why you don't leave on the early train. We don't know what to tell him. Besides, he wishes to speak to you personally, so please open the door. I'm sure he will be good enough to excuse the mess in your room. Good morning, Herr Samsa, the head clerk interrupted in a friendly tone.
He is not well,
said Gregor's mother to the head clerk, while his father was still talking at the door.
Believe me, sir, he is not well. Otherwise, how would Gregor ever miss a train? The boy thinks of nothing but his work. I almost get annoyed that he never goes out in the evening. He's been here 8 days now, but he stays in every evening. He sits quietly at home with us at the table, reads the paper, or studies timetables. His only distraction is to get on with his vet work. For instance, he spends 2 or 3 evenings making a small picture frame. You'll be amazed how pretty it is, hanging in his room. You'll see it soon as he opens the door. I'm very happy that you're here, sir. We would have never got Gregor to open the door on our own. He's so stubborn, and I'm sure he's not well, although he insisted he was this morning. I'm coming. Right away, said Gregor, slowly and cautiously, not stirring, so he did not miss a single word of the exchange. It is the only explanation that I can think of, madam, said the head clerk. I hope it is nothing serious. Though I must say that we businessmen very often, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, simply have to overcome a slight indisposition for the sake of our work. So you're going to let the head clerk in now? Gregor's father asked impatiently. No, said Gregor. There was an awkward silence in the room on the left. In the room on the right, his sister began to sob. Why didn't his sisters join the others? She must have only just got out of bed, and hadn't even begun to get dressed. And why was she crying? Was it because he wouldn't get up and let the head clerk in because he was in danger of losing his job, and because his employer would then pursue his parents with his old demands? But for the moment, these worries were surely unnecessary. Gregor was still there, and he had not the slightest intention of forsaking his family. Certainly, just now he was laying there on the carpet, and no one who knew the state he was in could seriously have expected him to admit the head clerk into his room. But he could not very well be dismissed on the spot for his trivial lack of courtesy, for which he could later find a suitable excuse. It seemed to Gregor that it would be much more sensible to leave him in peace just now, instead of bothering him with tears and entreaties. But it was their lack of awareness that upset them, and excused their behavior. Herr Samsa, the head clerk then called in a louder voice. What is the matter? You barricade yourself in your room. Answer only yes or no. Give your parents quite unnecessary cause for serious concern. And, I mention this only, by the way, neglect your duties to the firm quite outrageously. I'm speaking on behalf of your parents and your employer, and in all seriousness, I'm asking for an immediate and clear explanation. I'm astonished. Quite astonished. I thought of you as a calm and sensible person, and now you suddenly seem to have started playing fool and indulging in strange whims. The chief actually suggested to me this morning a possible explanation for your absence. It was about the funds you were recently entrusted with. But I very nearly gave him my solemn word of honor that this explanation could not be correct. But now, in view of your inexplicable obstinacy, I now no longer have the slightest desire to speak up for you. And your position is not at all secure by any means. I had originally intended to say all this to you between ourselves. But since you are making me waste my time here for no purpose, I do not see why your parents should not know it too. It is that your performance has recently been most unsatisfactory. It may not be the most productive time of year to do business. We recognize that. But there is not and cannot be a time of year when no business is done, Herr Samsa. But sir, cried Gregor, beside himself, forgetting everything else in his agitation. I will open the door at once. But this moment, a slight indecision, an attack of vertigo has prevented me from getting up. I'm still in bed, but now I feel perfectly well again. I'm just getting out of bed. Only be patient for a moment, please. It is not as easy as I thought, but I am quite well now. It's odd how these things can suddenly affect you. Yesterday evening I was quite well, my parents will tell you. Or rather, yesterday evening I felt something. They must have noticed it. Why didn't I report it to the office? But then one always thinks they can get over an illness without having to stay at home. Please consider my parents, sir. All the charges you have just brought against me are groundless. No one has said a single word to me about them. Perhaps you have not read the latest orders I sent in. Besides, I'm going to leave on the 8 o'clock train. These few hours rest have given me my strength back. Don't let me take up your time, sir. I'll be in the office myself right away. Please be good enough to tell them that. And give my respects to the chief.
While Gregor was stammering all this out, scarcely knowing in his haste what he was saying, he had managed, without difficulty, no doubt thanks to the exercises he had already practiced in bed, to get close to the chest of drawers, and was now trying to use it to pull himself upright. He really wanted to open the door, wanted to show himself and have a word with the head clerk. He was curious to find out what the others, who were just now so eager to see him, would say at the sight of him. If they were alarmed, then Gregor had no further obligation, and could keep calm. If they accepted it all calmly, then he had no reason to get worked up, and could, indeed, if he hurried, be at the station for 8 o'clock. At first, however, he slid down the smooth chest of drawers a few times. But then he gave one final heave, and stood there, upright. He no longer paid any attention to the pain in his abdomen, however much it stung. He then let himself fall against the back of a nearby chair, and held on tight to its edges with his tiny legs. In this way, he also regained self-control, and was silent, for now he could listen to what the head clerk was saying. "Did you understand a single word?" the head clerk asked his parents. "Surely he isn't trying to make fools of us?"
In heaven's name!
cried his mother, beginning to weep.
Perhaps he's very ill, and we're tormenting him. Greta! Greta!
She then shouted.
Mother!
Called his sister from the other room. They were communicating through Gregor's room.
You must fetch the doctor at once. Gregor is ill. Quick, fetch the doctor. Did you hear Gregor speak just now?
That was the voice of an animal, said the head clerk, remarkably quietly, in contrast to the shouts of Gregor's mother. Anna! Anna! His father called through the hall into the kitchen. Fetch a locksmith at once. And now the two girls were running through the hallway, their skirts rustling. How had his sister got dressed so quickly, and wrenched the doors of the apartment open? He did not hear them close the doors. He assumed they had left them open, as was usual in an apartment when a great calamity had happened. Gregor, however, had become much calmer. They may not understand what he was saying, in spite of the fact that his words had seemed to him clear enough, clearer than before, perhaps because his ears had gotten used to them. But at least they now understood that all was not quite right with him, and were prepared to help. The confident and assured way the initial arrangements had been made did him good. He felt a part of human society again, and hoped for great and extraordinary things of the doctor and the locksmith, though without really distinguishing between them very clearly. In order to make his voice as clear as possible for the crucial discussions to come, he cleared his throat gently, being careful to do this very discreetly, since it was possible that even this could sound quite different from a human cough, something he was no longer confident that he could judge for himself. Meanwhile, not a sound was heard from the next room. Perhaps his parents were sitting at a table with the head clerk, whispering. Perhaps they were all crouched by the door, listening. Gregor slowly pushed himself towards the door with the help of the chair, then let it go and threw himself against the door, held himself upright against it. The round pads on his leg had some sticky substance on them, and stayed there for a moment to recover from his exertions. Then he began to turn the key in the lock with his mouth. Unfortunately, it seemed that he had no teeth, so what was he going to grasp the key with? On the other hand, he did have very strong jaws, and with these he actually managed to move the key, paying no heed to the damage it was already doing to himself, for brown liquid oozed out of his mouth, ran over the key, and dripped onto the floor. "Listen," said the head clerk in the next room. "He's turning the key." This encouraged Gregor greatly, but they should all have shouted out to him, his father and mother too. "Go on, Gregor," they should have shouted. "Keep at it. Keep going at the lock." And imagining that they were all following his efforts in suspense, he frantically clamped his jaws onto the key with all his strength. As the key turned in the lock, he too turned with it, Now he was only holding himself upright with his jaws, alternately hanging onto the key or forcing it down again with the whole weight of his body. The click of the lock, as it finally snapped open, brought Gregor abruptly to his senses. With a deep breath, he said to himself, "So I didn't need the locksmith after all," and pressed his head down on the handle to open the door. Because he had to open the door in this way, it was in fact already wide open, and he himself was still nowhere to be seen. He had to edge his way slowly around the door, very carefully of course, to prevent himself from falling flat on his back before he got into the next room. He was still concentrating on this difficult maneuver, having no time to pay attention to anything else, when he heard the head clerk gasp out loud, "Oh!" It sounded like the wind sighing, and then, since he was nearest the door, Gregor caught sight of him, holding his hand over his wide-open mouth, and slowly retreating, as if driven back by the steady pressure of an unseen force. His mother, in spite of the presence of the head clerk, she was standing there with dishevelled hair, still tousled from her night's sleep, first clasped her hands together and looked at his father, then took 2 steps towards Gregor and collapsed amidst her spreading petticoats, her face sunk out of sight against her breast. His father raised his clenched fist menacingly, as if intended to shove Gregor back into his room, then looked helplessly around the living room, covered his eyes with his hands, and wept, his sobs shaking his powerful chest. Gregor now made no move to enter the room. Instead, he leaned from the inside against the firmly bolted wing of the double door, so that the others could see only half his body, and above it, his head, tilted to one side, peering at them. Meanwhile, it had become much lighter outside, and on the other side of the street, part of the grey, endless black building, it was a hospital, stood clearly out, with its evenly spaced windows harshly intruding into the facade. The rain was still falling, but only in huge single drops that could be seen as they fell heavily, one by one, to the ground below. The breakfast dishes were piled up on the table, for breakfast was, for his father, the most important meal of the day, which was protracted for hours while he read various newspapers. On the wall directly opposite hung a huge photograph of Gregor from his military service, showing him as a lieutenant, his hand on his sword, smiling and relaxed, his posture and his uniform commanding respect. The door to the hallway was open, and since the main door of the apartment was also open, through it could be seen the landing and the top of the staircase leading down. "Well," said Gregor, fully aware that he was the only one who had remained calmed, "shall I get dressed right away? Pack my samples and leave? You will let me leave, won't you? You see, sir, I am not obstinate, and I enjoy my work. Travelling is tiresome, but I could not live without travelling." "Where are you going, sir? To the office? You are? Will you report everything truthfully? One can be temporarily unfit for work, but that's just the right time to remember one's past achievements, and to remind oneself that later, once the problem has been resolved, one will work all the harder and more carefully. I am so indebted to the chief, as you know very well. On the other hand, I have to care for my parents and my sister. I am in a quandary, but I shall work my way out of it. Don't make it more difficult for me than it already is. Put in a good word for me at the office. They don't like the travelling salesman, I know. They think we earn big money and lead a grand life, too. They have no particular reason to correct this prejudice. But you, sir, in your position, you have a better view of things than the rest of the staff. Indeed, I say, strictly in confidence, you have a better view than the chief himself, who, as a businessman, can be easily misled into judging of an employee unfairly. You also know very well that a salesman, who is away from the office almost the whole year round, can so easily become a victim of gossip, chance, and unfolded complaints he can't possibly defend himself against, because he doesn't usually hear about any of it. And when he does come home, exhausted from travelling, and only then he experiences for himself the awful consequences without being able to make out what caused it all. Please don't leave, sir, without a word that you agree with me, at least in part." But the head clerk had turned away at Gregor's first words, and only looked back at him over the shuddering shoulder with his mouth agape. And while Gregor was speaking, he could not stand still for a moment. Without once taking his eyes off him, he had backed towards the door, but very gradually, as if there were some secret prohibition against leaving the room. He had already reached the hall, and finally withdrew his foot from the living room with a sudden movement that gave the impression that he had just stepped on hot coals. But in the hallway, he stretched out his right hand towards the staircase, as if some truly unearthly redemption awaited him there. Gregor realized that he could not possibly let the head clerk leave in this frame of mind without putting his position in the firm at the utmost risk. His parents did not fully understand all this. Over many years, they had become convinced that Gregor had a secure position for life in the business. And in any case, they were so preoccupied with their present worries that they had become incapable of looking ahead. But Gregor could look ahead. The head clerk had to be detained, reassured, persuaded, and finally won over. After all, Gregor's future and that of his family depended on it. If only his sister were here. She was clever, and she had wept while Gregor was still calmly laying on his back. And the head clerk, that ladies' man, would surely have listened to her. She would have closed the front door, and in the hall she would have talked him out of his fright. But his sister was not there, so Gregor himself had to act. It did not occur to him at present that he still had no idea of his ability to move about, nor did it occur to him that his speech had possibly, indeed probably, not been understood. He let go of the wing of the door and pushed himself through the opening. He wanted to go across to the head clerk, who was gripping the hallway banister tightly with both hands in a ridiculous manner. But Gregor, trying to find a hold, immediately slid and fell onto his many legs with a faint cry. He had scarcely done so than he felt, for the first time that morning, physically uncomfortable. His legs were on firm ground. He realized to his delight that they did their best to carry him where he wished to go. And now he believed very soon that he would finally be cured of all his ills. But just as he lay there, shaking with intense relief, not far across the room from his mother, who had seemed so completely absorbed in herself, she suddenly jumped up, her arms outstretched and her fingers spread out wide, and cried out, "Help! In God's name, help!" She bent down, as if to look at Gregor more closely, but instead she recoiled instinctively, forgetting that behind her stood the laden table. As she reached it, she hurriedly perched herself on it, and in her distraction, seemed not to notice when she upset the large coffee pot beside her, sending a great stream of coffee pouring onto the carpet. "Mother, mother," said Gregor softly, looking up at her. He had completely forgotten about the head clerk for the moment, but at the sight of the stream of coffee, he could not resist champing his empty jaws several times. At this, his mother shrieked again, fled from the table, and fell into his father's arms as he rushed towards her. But now Gregor had no time for his parents. The head clerk was already on the stairs, and with his chin against the banister, took one last look back. Gregor started off in an attempt to catch him, but the head clerk must have suspected something, for he leapt down several steps and disappeared with a shout of "Ah!" that echoed through the whole stairwell. Unfortunately, his father, who had so far kept relatively calm, seemed completely unnerved by the head clerk's flight. For instead of running after the head clerk himself, or at least letting Gregor run after him, he seized in his right hand the stick the head clerk had left on a chair, together with his hat and his overcoat. With his left hand, took the large newspaper from the table, and began to drive Gregor back into his room by waving the stick and newspaper at him, and stamping his feet. No pleading from Gregor helped, and no one understood him. However meekly he turned his head, his father only stamped his feet the harder. Across the room, his mother had thrown open the window in spite of the cool weather, and leaning far outside, she buried her face in her hands. Between the street and the stairwell, a violent draught blew up. The curtains flew about, the newspapers on the table rustled, and single sheets flew across the floor. Implacably, his father advanced, hissing like a savage. But so far, Gregor had had no practice at all in going backwards, and so moved very slowly. If only he had been able to turn around, he would have reached his room at once. But he was afraid that this time-consuming exercise would try his father's patience, and at any moment he faced the threat of a deadly blow on the back of his head from the stick in his father's hand. But in the end, Gregor had no alternative, for he realized to his horror that while going backwards, he could not even keep his direction, and so, casting constant sideways glances at his father, he began to turn around as fast as he possibly could, though it actually happened very slowly. Perhaps his father noticed his good intentions, for he did not interrupt him in this process, and even directed Gregor's movements from a distance with the end of his stick. If only his father would not make that intolerable hissing noise. It made Gregor lose his head completely. He had almost turned right around, with that hissing still in his ears when he made a mistake, and even turned back a little. But when at last he managed to get his head as far as the front door, it turned out that his body was too wide to get through the opening. Of course, it did not remotely occur to his father, in his present state of mind, to open the other wing of the door, for instance, to give Gregor enough space to pass through. His only thought was that Gregor had to get back into his room as soon as possible. And he would never have permitted the elaborate preparations Gregor needed to hold himself upright and perhaps get through the door that way. Instead, he drove on with more noise than ever, as if there were no obstacle. At Gregor's back, it no longer sounded like the voice of a single father. It really was no laughing matter anymore, and Gregor squeezed himself, come what may, against the door. He lifted one side of his body till he was laying askew in the door opening. His one side was rubbed quite raw and left ugly blotches on the white door. Soon he was stuck tight and could no longer move without help. His legs on one side were wiggling in the air. Those on the other were painfully pressed against the floor. When his father gave him a truly liberating violent shove from behind, and he shot, bleeding heavily, right across the room, the door was slammed shut with the stick. And at last, it was quiet. Thank you so very much for listening. If you enjoyed, please like, comment, share, all that jazz. If you really enjoyed, please do subscribe because there's more to come. If you really, really enjoyed it, please feel free to donate to the channel because it is so hot in here. I need air conditioning, I need to pay rent, I need to buy food, all those sort of wonderful things. Just watching, subscribing means already a ton, and it's incredible that I get to do this. I don't know where I'm going with this. If you're on podcast, thank you so much. Leave a review as it helps get in front of as many people as possible, and reading your reviews really makes my day. And until next time, bye-bye.